Okay, we're live. All right. Hi, everybody. I am going to just wait for some people to comment, and then I'm going to introduce who I'm speaking to. I hope this is working. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Hi, Michelle. Okay, we're working. So let me just start. I'm probably not going to read too many comments because I don't want to take up Brian's time too much. Should I call you Brian or Dr. Sullivan? What
No,
would you
you
prefer?
call me Brian, man.
Okay, all right. Okay, so I just want to introduce the guest. This is Dr. Brian Sullivan. He is a researcher and instructor at the La Jolla Institute of Immunology. And he's going to just talk to us about uh, some some topics, obviously, that I'm sure people are concerned about. Um, Brian is somebody who watches on Periscope, so he actually was nice enough to call in once. I know he was juggling kids, and he still called in, so I am really appreciative of him calling that time, and even more so now. So, thank you so much for coming in, Brian. I
Oh, it's
appreciate
my
it.
pleasure. No, it's my pleasure.
Okay, so I want to say Brian has a great blog. I'm going to post after the broadcast. He did a blog. Basically, maybe you can talk about it. A lot of
Sure.
people ask you, I guess because you're as a virologist, you said you're working in the shadows, and now because of the whole situation, that's not the case anymore.
Yeah, and honestly, the reason I started the blog is because I had I think like a lot of us, when we got stuck at home, we started chatting a lot to our old friends and things like that. So me and a bunch of my buddies have a WhatsApp chat group, um, and they kept asking me questions about it. And I was like, okay, all right. Instead, I would write these like long paragraphs, in WhatsApp, and they're like, dude, you should just write a blog about it, and then you can
Yeah.
just point us to that information. So that's how it kind of got started. Um, just to
You just
consolidate some of that information for people.
mhm. It's a great blog. Answers so many questions. Yeah, you started it quite a while back. I kind of got
Yeah.
into it just in January, but you were explaining a lot of the things, and still there's a lot of things to learn about on the blog too. So I'm going to post that, and I'm going to talk about some of the things. I'm sure you guys can read it, but I have some of the questions too about some of the things that he mentioned there. Another thing is I'm going to post. Brian did a podcast with the CDC, and he explained about his research with Lassa Fever. So, are you a specialist in Lassa Fever? Is that accurate to say that?
Yeah, yeah. So I've been studying Lassa fever and similar viruses. We model them in mice too, but for the last 10 years or so. We also studied, so me and my lab would go over to West Africa to study patients that had Lassa fever. And also
Okay.
that kind of coincided at the same time during the Ebola outbreak back in 2015. So we did some studies trying to understand um, the immunity against Ebola from
Okay.
survivors there. Yeah.
So, just for people watching, maybe they don't know what it is. Can you tell us what Lassa Fever is?
Sure, sure. Lassa fever, it's not that many people know about it, but it affects hundreds of thousands of people across West Africa every year.
Hmm.
It's a disease that's very similar to Ebola. So you get some mucosal bleeding. The kind of initial signs and symptoms are pretty similar. They're flu-like symptoms. Pretty similar, actually, what people get with Ebola early on. So headache, fevers, malaise, muscle aches, things like that. And so it seems like a lot of people are infected, but only a subset of people get very severe disease. So if you get that severe disease, it's actually highly deadly. So if you end up going to the hospital because you have Lassa fever, only about 50% of people survive. Um,
Okay.
and there's no medication for it. There's no vaccines. There's kind of an off-label use of a drug called ribavirin that you may have heard of
Yeah.
initially, because I think people had tried to use it against SARS-CoV-2 as well. But that doesn't seem to be very effective. Um, So it's a serious problem across mostly rural West Africa, and people get it from mice there. It's usually from mice to humans. So unlike Ebola, where you have like a single event and it kind of creates a chain through humans, typically most Lassa infections happen between a rodent and a human. And then it can spread a little bit like in hospitals because of all the bodily fluids kind of that the very serious cases kind of come out. It's
Okay.
very infectious, but
Okay, that was my question because in the broadcast you said the CDC podcast you mentioned that it mainly passes through rodent feces, rodent droppings,
right, right. So
and
a lot of people in the rural West Africa have these kind of thatched roofs, and so the kind of rodents kind of scurry across it, or they can get into the food supply, and so they think that that's how people get it.
okay, and it falls down and they inhale it.
Yeah, they breathe it in or inhale it, or it's still a little kind of mysterious exactly what the root is. That's what's thought.
So how many people get seriously infected with Lassa fever?
I
You
mean, that
said
is
only from.
it's several. It's probably per year. It's probably in the thousands to tens of thousands. It's really hard to tell because this happens in rural West Africa,
Oh yeah,
and diagnosis is very difficult.
yeah.
A lot of the times, it seems like people, the symptoms are people get malaria there, like sometimes several times a year, and so the symptoms are, you get a fever, a high fever, and you feel terrible. But people are usually like, crap, I have malaria again.
All the same seems like.
And yeah, and then there's typhoid fever, which has a kind of a similar disease progression as well. But so it ends up being like, okay, they treat people for malaria, they don't get better. They treat people for typhoid, they don't get better. And so then if they survive that long, then sometimes they're referred to specialist hospitals, depending on where in West Africa you are. It seems like from, when people are more educated about Lassa fever, they catch
Mhm.
more cases. So there was
I see.
in Nigeria, actually, where a lot of the cases are, they specifically trained 3 regions to try to recognize Lassa fever and the symptoms. And then the positive case numbers went up in the region. It's very likely it's just because people were more aware of that disease.
Okay.
So
So
I
they're
mean,
just
a lot
educating
of
the
it goes,
public.
yeah, it just goes undiagnosed, I think, across West Africa.
I see. Okay. So between humans, you said it's only transmitted in hospitals, most likely, not like in a household or like a virus like COVID is airborne. It's not that.
Yeah, so usually if because it's people who are really sick, so they'll have like a lot of diarrhea, they'll be vomiting, so there's kind of virus particles in that.
Okay.
You can spread it within household members if like somebody's a caregiver and they're taking care of somebody. Oftentimes, Lassa fever affects pregnant women pretty dramatically. So if they get sick in the 3rd trimester, it's usually
Okay.
100% fatal. And if they get sick anytime during pregnancy, it's usually fatal for the fetus as well. So that's actually, and I think that's what I try to push in the podcast. Is kind of my hypothesis is that it's a severe. It's possible that Lassa fever, especially in rural areas of West Africa, is a big contributor to stillbirths and spontaneous abortions. I
But
would
just
love for
haven't
some.
made the connection yet.
What's that?
They just haven't made the connection yet between.
Yeah, exactly. So they're doing a lot of serial surveys now. So there's a group called CEPI, which is a big nonprofit that is looking to create vaccines to some of the most deadly pathogens. It's funded by the Gates Foundation and some other things. So they're actually spending a lot of money to develop Lassa fever vaccine. And within that, they're doing a lot of epidemiology as well. So hopefully some of that information will maybe come out and see how widespread it really is.
Okay, so it's not, because it's kind of vague what it is. I guess they can't really declare it an epidemic. Is it considered an epidemic in that region, or there's just not enough
Well,
information?
no, it's considered, I guess, endemic in the region. So it's always
And
present, and it's something that you're not going to be able to get rid of because it's always going to be in the rodent population.
okay,
They've done enough sero surveys of rodents. So some of my colleagues at Tulane, who have a lot of experts on Lassa Fever. They have their collaborators in Sierra Leone. They trap rodents, they do rodent surveys, and it seems like the places that have a high amount of the specific rodent that has a lot of Lassa Fever, then that particular town or village ends up having a lot of Lassa Fever as well.
Okay.
And it seems like it's seasonal too. So they get it all year round, but it's higher in the the dry season. So in the dry season, it seems like there's more cases, and we don't know whether it's because the rodents come into households in the dry season because there's more food, or maybe they're burning their fields for the season, and so then the rodents go. It's kind of unclear why that is.
Okay, so I guess lockdowns are not effective to contain that sort of
Lassa Fever. Yeah, no, yeah.
Okay, all right. So I guess we can kind of segue into this. One of the things you say in your blog is the seasonality of the myth or the fallacy of thinking that there's a seasonality and there's waves to this virus that we're going through now. That's something you discuss on your blog. Can you talk about?
Sure. And it really bothered me early on, only because there was almost zero data that it's only because I kept hearing it keep being mentioned, but there was no data early on that supported that they're seasonal, because you had plenty of cases in the southern hemisphere,
right?
Plenty of cases in the northern hemisphere. You had plenty of cases in some tropical areas. So it didn't seem like weather had anything to do with it, and what really had something to do with it is people's actions, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I don't like, we can now talk about how there's waves of infection, but that's only because those waves are because people became kind of lax in their own actions, right? So, we saw that the cases go down. We start opening up restaurants again. I think this is especially true in the U.S., where I was actually surprised initially how well people were doing in the initial lockdown.
It was bad. Pretty tight.
Yeah, but because people were really scared initially, and I think people got complacent, and then they don't care. Like, they have some people that they know that maybe had COVID and they were fine, and maybe they know of anybody that died or got severely ill. So I think you only need a very small percentage of the population, I think, to kind of flout these rules, or to have certain restaurants open or indoor areas people congregate, to start getting this climb in cases. And so I think what's especially disturbing lately is that if these new variants that spread more easily, so I have a colleague, Christian Anderson, who's a geneticist, and he's been doing a lot of work in sequencing the viruses and tracking it.
Okay.
And he had basically calculated that every time, on the downslope of the curve, right, there's a thing called an R0. So it's like how much of the virus spreads at any given time. So if it's 1, right, if it's 1, then each person that gets it only infects another person. But if it's 2, then each person that infects it infects 2 other people, et cetera, et cetera. So every time we were on this downslope, we had just gotten just under 1, like 0.9 or something, right?
Okay.
But what these new variants seem to do is kind of increase that threshold. So now our actions that would lead to the lower side of the slope going down 9, you'd bump that up to maybe 1.2 or something. And so then instead of going down, we're going to go back up. So the actions that we take during, these lockdowns or these periods where they close various sectors might not be as effective, essentially, in stopping the spread as it would otherwise be. So.
Okay. So why does it increase the variance? Why exactly does it?
We don't know. So it's unclear. It seems like it's associated with more viremia maybe in the nasal cavities. So when people swab the people that have these viruses, it seems like the amount of virus in your nasal cavity is higher than people that had the old variant. So, but nobody knows why that is. Is it because it replicates better, perhaps, in the nasal cavities, and so then you pass it on to people? That's easier, or maybe it just it takes less amount of viruses to infect a certain person, so that's a possibility. So I don't think it's really known. There's a lot of hypotheses out there, but I think there's not much data to really back up why these variants are they spread more easily. Right?
Okay, let's talk about that. Another great fact that you mentioned on your blog is what should I say? Which one of the variants was the most important? Was the first one, right? The first leap,
right?
Man,
right? So, and I think that was the case for Ebola too. And you might have heard that there's another Ebola outbreak in Guinea now, in West Africa.
No.
Yeah, so there's another one. It seemed like the first documented cases at the end of January. So I'm not sure how much it spread, and it's done a similar thing as with that first big Ebola outbreak in West Africa, where a lot of the spread seemed to come from a funeral. But in any case, it seems like it's similar to that. So when they compare, so we can make the analogy to Ebola, and like they compare, the sequences that they see in people versus the sequences that they get from other animals. There seems to be several changes that occur, and I think it's the same thing. So when people sequence SARS coronaviruses anyway from animals, they see there's a lot of differences. So it seems like it's very likely, and because this doesn't happen that often, that there's just some infrequent event. A lot of people think that this infrequent event is probably some transmission between several animals, or else otherwise maybe we'd see this a lot more often. So with Ebola, there's a hypothesis that it goes through from bats to chimps to humans, and it needs to go through that process, because every time a new virus gets introduced to a new person, right, it's not specifically tailored to that new species, right? So maybe it can affect a little bit, and then like viruses always do, they always mutate, but then some viruses will get selected. So you pull out of that pool of viruses, a few of those will have the random mutations that make it more easily spread, right? And you wouldn't see it unless those mutations were somehow selected, right? So I don't like.
They just spread and they spread.
Right, and so it's just unlucky enough that it goes from one animal, you get those mutations, it ends up maybe in another animal, maybe directly to humans, but it's probably those first random mutations that get passed along, and those are, the viruses fit enough to then spread to the new species, right? And so the viruses are always mutating, right? So we have to stop thinking about it like, oh, this virus is mutating more now. It's not. The viruses mutate at a rate, and then the viruses that are better, this different mutations, get selected out because they are better. And if they weren't better, then we wouldn't see it, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So now is it a matter of a race to get people vaccinated before variants or it mutates to something more dangerous? Is that correct? Or do things mutate? Do they become weaker as they mutate? Because that means they spread easier.
So, that's a good question. So we have to think about it as what is the selective pressure that will end up selecting some of these mutations, right? So this is tough, and I think I touched on it a little bit, I think, in one of my blogs, and I'm embarrassed I haven't updated my blog in a long time, but I think some of these things still hold true, right? This is essentially the worst case scenario that I had pictured probably like 6 or 8 months ago, where we have, uncontrolled viral spread throughout the world, right? There's all these different mutations, there's all these viruses have this differentiated enough so that there's a lot of different now mutations that are present in the human population, right? And then now we're going to go in with a vaccine, right? And the vaccines are actually really good. So even So even the best vaccines, I think, will still protect because there's different. It's you give somebody immunity to something, right? And there's you get a lot of different types of antibodies that bind. You have another arm of your immune system called T cells. So these things all work together, and it's not just one little area of the protein of the virus that they're recognizing. It's different areas. And so it would be very difficult for the virus to mutate to completely escape the vaccine, right?
Okay.
But, vaccine right now, the pressure on that vaccine is like anything that ends up spreading better is going to win out, right?
Right.
But, and then there's some indication maybe these are more deadly. So that's a possibility, but it's not going to be, I think, in order of magnitude more deadly. I think that what they're seeing is maybe
Gradual.
it's a little bit, because it would not be that beneficial for the virus to kill off its host before it can spread to somebody else, right? There's no selective pressure to kill a person, essentially. The only selective pressure is for it to get to somebody else, right, and to spread, because then that virus ends up going out, right? Yeah. So going back, I was like, well, this is possibly the worst situation, because you have all this, basically this alphabet soup of different viruses that are all around the world, and then now we're putting a certain pressure on it, right? And then some of these things are going to come out. The only viruses that are going to be left are the ones,
the stronger one.
the ones that can evade our immunity somewhat, right? I think what is really going to end up happening, honestly, is that, I think most of these vaccines that we see that work well now, ones that work well, like 80%, 90%, I think that the work to get people out of the hospitals, vaccinated people might get sick with some of the new variants, but I don't think they'll end up in the hospital. I don't think people end up dead. I think what's going to end up happening is the entire world gets vaccinated. Is that we're gonna basically see the hospitals emptied of COVID patients. People might get sick, but they're not going to get really sick. And the virus is just here to stay, man. I mean, and early on, I thought we could control it, but there was just no will to do what was needed to control it. And now the cat's out of the bag. I mean, you can't put a lid back on this. So
no. So it's going to be like a common cold kind of thing?
I think it's going to be like a common cold. And it might be, a little worse than the common cold for some people. And people who are unvaccinated, they're going to get hit harder. So if you go around and you decide you don't want the vaccine, I think because of these new variants still cause disease in some people, they'll still be spread. So I think those people that remain unvaccinated will be susceptible still.
So vulnerable.
Yeah. So and then we'll end up saying that, as more and more people get vaccinated, that R0 number is going to get lower and lower. So it might not be that there's that amount of virus everywhere, but just like measles, like there's not that much measles out in the world, but you stop vaccinating some people and it pops up, it pops up in communities where they're not vaccinated.
It'll come back.
Yeah. So you only need a little bit of this thing. I mean, this whole thing started with a single case, right? And now it's worldwide. So
right.
It's really hard to eliminate any viruses. We've only done it twice, with smallpox and rinderpest.
Someone here has a question. They said, is it possible that some populations, such as in Taiwan, may have some inherent immunity?
Yes, so that's actually a lot of interesting research on this now. So there was a study. Okay, so let me go back. It seems like there's people that have some inherent immunity to the coronavirus. Okay, and so what has been measured is people see that there's these types of cells called T cells that recognizes little pieces of the virus, and then they can go and directly kill the infected cells, right? There seems to be cross-reactivity. So T cells that are specific to one of the 4 common cold coronaviruses that can also fight against SARS-CoV-2. And it seems like people that have this kind of low level of these specific T cells don't get sick with coronavirus. So it was a study that they did in England. If you had like a certain level of this cell response, they didn't see people get sick, or people that, maybe they got sick, but maybe they got infected, but they didn't have overt signs of illness, right?
Okay.
So it's very possible that that kind of pre-existing immunity in some people is the reason why some people maybe get really sick and some people don't get that sick. There's so many factors in this, though. It's how much virus were you exposed to, and we know that wearing masks can reduce the amount of virus that you might be exposed to, and you'll get less sick because of that. So it might be how much virus you're exposed to, what your pre-existing immunity is. It could be the route of infection, whether it's, you touched your face or whether you inhaled something. So there's so many variables that might affect how somebody gets sick, but it seems like at least the people that have this kind of basal response, this low response, memory response to coronaviruses might not get ill from SARS-CoV-2.
So it's possible a whole community, like, I don't know, he said in Taiwan, maybe
I don't know a whole community. Maybe those coronaviruses circulate really widely. No, I wanted to do, before, so I was at Scripps beforehand, and I had a collaboration with some people in Colorado State who are looking at hospitalized people. But before that, I was thinking about writing a grant, looking at specifically the question I want to ask is people with very young kids, or people that work in like preschools, do they have better kind of this basal immunity to SARS-CoV-2?
okay.
Because I don't know how many of your audience has young kids, but I have two boys, they're 4 and 6, and during the first 3 years, I was like sick, like every month I had something.
Oh, really? Yeah, right.
And these things like run through school like crazy. So it's very possible that that community of people with young kids and people that work in preschools, they might have these higher level of background immunity, and then we could and if I wanted to compare their immune response to people that maybe didn't have kids or that don't work in those kinds of settings, and then see, are those people more protected versus kind of the general community? This is a question I kind of want to answer. But the study in England kind of did that same kind of question, just with a different population. But that's only one study, and I think the jury's still out on that. There's certainly been other studies that look at cross-reactive response, but that might be a reason. I don't know about a whole community in Taiwan. There's hypothesis of maybe how that could happen, but I wouldn't want to speculate specifically without knowing what those are. Taiwan, I know, has been doing a really good job, and islands in general are a lot easier to contain.
Yeah.
And they've done a really good job at containing coronavirus. So I would probably say that the reason Taiwan hasn't had huge outbreaks is because of more of their actions than their biology. But
yeah, one of the person who's chatting, he's from Taiwan. He kind of updates us all the time, and it sounds like their vice president is an immunologist. So he's the man. He's definitely the situation for them in this circumstance. So, okay, there's another person here. They're asking the vaccine for immune compromised people. Is there any risks involved for people who are immunocompromised?
That's a good question. So not. That's a good question. I think it. I think it depends on the type of vaccine, right? And I think the data is still not entirely clear with that. So I would say, there's a couple types of vaccines out there. There's right now that have been kind of approved. There's an mRNA vaccine, which is basically just the genetic code of a piece of the virus, and it's surrounded in basically a fat molecule, a lipid, and then that just goes in and it tells your cells how to make this just one little part of the virus, right? So from that, I don't think necessarily that would be dangerous for somebody, because there's no way that kind of get out of control. I don't know how, depending on what kind of immune compromised situation you have, I don't know how effective those vaccines will be if you have a harder time making an immune response. I don't know if the data is really out there for that. These are pretty new vaccines.
Yeah.
And it's unclear in various populations how these would act. Certainly, I wouldn't, if I were immune compromised, I wouldn't hesitate to get it, because even if you're immune compromised, you definitely don't want to get SARS-CoV-2.
No.
And you're not gonna, it's really doubtful that you'd have some sort of bad response, at least in the mRNA vaccines. Then there's other vaccines, these adenovirus vaccines, and some are these live vector vaccines. So they're kind of live viruses that carry a piece of the coronavirus.
Okay.
So honestly, I don't know about those. Again, it probably depends on what kind of autoimmune, either immune dysfunction you have.
I think it's cancer specifically this person's wondering about.
Cancer?
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
That, I wish I could give them a good answer on that, honestly. At this point, I don't know.
Okay.
I would say the mRNA vaccines, if it were me, I'd get it. So my own father has prostate cancer, and he's been kind of in remission, but he's had a lot of various treatments, and he's received his first vaccine. So, and it's in people like that who have cancer are very susceptible to these kinds of diseases. I wouldn't hesitate, for me, to get the vaccine, but certainly I would talk to your oncologist about it.
Of course, yeah.
Because it might be a specific case.
Okay. All right. Well, another interesting, kind of related to that, is one of the things on your blog you said about another thing that annoyed you. A lot of the things that you said were just maybe things in the news, or kind of ideas people got wrong. And one of them was about the way the media interprets data. They'll take it and just twist it into something else, or just not understand it. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it does annoy me, but it's also I can understand it. So
right. Yes.
I think a lot of people, they want really clear answers, and especially early on, people just didn't have answers, right? And so it seems like there's a lot of contradictions early on. Should we have worn masks early? Did we not wear masks early? Do masks protect? Initially, everybody's wiping down their mail and their boxes, but it doesn't seem like it's spread that way. So, a lot of those early kind of suggestions from doctors and scientists were kind of based on other diseases, right?
Okay.
But as far as there's just a lot of room for disinformation when we don't have a clear picture scientifically of what's going on, and so people want to fill in these blanks when we just at some point just have to say, we don't know this. This is our best guess, and we're just going to have to look at it to see how this progresses to get a specific answer, right?
Right.
So I think what's difficult when news organizations try to explain things is they don't make it clear what things are just unknowable at a certain given time, right?
Okay.
And then how we go about kind of learning those things. I don't know. Is there a specific thing that I was particularly irked about?
What it was is, you probably mentioned this at the beginning when there was less data, so I can understand your point at the beginning. There's just not enough information. People are kind of paranoid, making conclusions, trying to find what's happening. They just want to be informed what's going on.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's what you were referring to, is people making conclusions from things that maybe are not necessarily true.
And you see a lot of this with these vaccines too. I've heard from people like, "Oh my God, these mRNA vaccines are going to change your DNA," and it's just, if you knew the science, it's like, that's impossible. That's like saying the dog next door is going to turn into a dragon and fly across the town and set buildings on fire. Like in the realm of possibilities, this thing doesn't like change your DNA. It doesn't, it just doesn't act that way if you know what the biology is. But a lot of people aren't experts at this, so it takes a lot of explaining. And I think for people to come out and try to listen, and I understand that it's hard because you just have to trust doctors or scientists to kind of say, and there's a lot of quacks out there, even that crazy, I don't even remember his name, that was in Trump's administration that had that was saying a bunch of crazy, Dr. Atlas, that guy.
I don't recall.
Okay. Well, anyway, he was it's always like these so-called experts that are not in the field. So I think he was like an anesthesiologist or something, or maybe a neuroscientist or something. But he had no background in infectious disease, and so he was saying a bunch of crazy stuff.
Okay.
So again, I can understand why, it's hard for people without that expertise to kind of, decide who to trust at that point, right?
For the general public to agree.
Yeah. So.
I think the specific thing on your site was you were talking about people, how their immunity, if they already become sick, what are their chances of being sick again? I think that was one of the
Right. Yeah. Oh, right.
Said,
yeah.
How
so
the media.
This really got me. So there was this push early on to figure out how to people to use as antibody tests, right? And about even now, I think there's if I was exposed already, then I'm fine. I don't need to, I can't get exposed again. There was a lot of these assumptions that I think we know aren't true now. And the reason that annoyed me is because, we can if we just take what we knew from coronaviruses, right? So, we had SARS coronavirus, and we studied a lot of people with SARS coronavirus. This is the coronavirus that came out in the early 2000s, right? The 2002.
Yeah.
And with those cases, the reason it was easy to stop is because everybody that got it got really sick, right? So, I think the mortality rate was in the 10% or so. But everybody who got it was, I think, hospitalized, almost everybody.
Okay.
So you can identify who had it, and also I think spread only when people were symptomatic. And so that was one thing that really made this coronavirus, our current situation, bad, because it seems like it spreads before people actually get sick.
Mm-hmm.
But in those cases, when they study those people, they can see immunity that lasts a really long time. Now, that SARS we contained it, and we essentially got rid of that particular virus in the human population anyway. And so we didn't have an idea of whether people could get reinfected with it, but it seemed like people in the very severe cases, people had really robust immunity, right? And we know from the current cold-causing coronaviruses, these are all very similar viruses, that people people get mild colds, and people can get yearly colds with the same virus, right? And so this one seemed like it fit right in the middle, right? Because you have people that are asymptomatic, you have people that have very little disease, and then you have people who go to the hospital. And what we kind of learn now is that the people that had really severe disease have a really robust immunity against it when they come out, and the people that don't have very severe disease, it looks like those common cold ones. So for people to assume that, I have antibodies against it, so now I'm fine, was just it just made me crazy.
Yeah.
And so while those antibody tests, I think, are an important part of an epidemiologist toolbox, it should never have been marketed to people, because it's essentially, if somebody has a positive antibody test, that information is basically useless to them, because we don't know if they can get infected again. We don't know if they can get infected and pass it on. Seems more and more now.
Letting their guard.
Yeah, so it's just giving people a false hope that maybe they're fine, or maybe they have a good antibody response then, So, 3 months down the line, it wanes, and then they get infected. We just didn't know, right? And more and more, we're seeing more and more people getting some reinfections because the amount of virus out there is bigger. And the other essential part of this is just like the common cold coronaviruses, where people get maybe infected yearly, or people get infected and then 12 months. This thing has only been around 12 months, right? So that initial pool of people that got infected in March, and a good percentage of them might be susceptible now, right? So it's kind of like a fool's errand to try to push these antibody tests, which I think they're pushing early on. I think less so now, which I'm glad about. But I think that's what got me a little hot at the collar.
Okay, so I guess connected to that, is there any cases of, I think the term you use is sterilizing immunity? Is that any relation to that?
So no. So when we talk about sterilizing immunity, that is, so when you get vaccinated for something, if your immune response is strong enough so that if you get exposed, you get almost no virus replication. So there's a couple different ways that when you get reinfected with a virus, or whether you get exposed to a virus after you've had an vaccination, there's a couple different ways that a vaccine or a previous infection can protect you. Okay, one is called sterilizing immunity, where you get exposed to something and your immune response basically just knocks it out immediately, right? It's not allowed to, maybe it can get in a few cells, but then that's about it, and then the infection is stopped. Then there's other kinds of immunity where, so for Lassa virus, for instance, once you get it once, you can get infected again, but you won't get the severe disease again, right? So that's non-sterilizing immunity. So you still have the virus that can replicate a little bit, but your immune system is strong enough that it doesn't get to the level where it gets you sick, right? It's possible you could still spread it a little bit, or not. We just don't know, well, at least with SARS-CoV-2. So that's kind of the best vaccines will kind of induce that sterilizing immunity, because then we know you can pass on the virus, right? So again, I think that's now with this virus and these vaccines that are coming up, we don't know if the immunity that's conferred by these vaccines, whether they're sterilizing or not, or whether they're maybe near sterilizing or not. So certainly, I think if you get vaccinated with ones that were meant for the original strains, and then maybe you get exposed, so maybe they're sterilizing for those original strains, but not for the new ones in South Africa, especially the South African and the Brazilian and Japanese ones. Maybe they're not sterilizing for those. We don't know yet, right? So that's why people still say, okay, you get vaccinated, you still should wear your mask,
I see.
I think there'll be a point. I'm just saying, I think there'll be a point, like I said before, where essentially like people stop getting hospitalized, and it won't be like, September 1st, everybody take off your mask, woohoo, it's over. It's gonna be this like, this fade away, I think. And, you're gonna see the numbers go down. You're gonna see like no people going to the hospital that haven't been vaccinated. And then just people are just gonna start going back to normal, right? But I think that's gonna take some time. But again, when going back to the sterilizing immunity, we don't know how well these vaccines induce that type of immunity, or if it's just they protect you from developing disease, right?
Okay, so it's about being able to spread it even though you're vaccinated. That's what it's about, sterilizing immunity.
That's what it's generally about. Yeah, it's a specific. I guess it's very specific to like how much the virus can replicate once you're exposed to it, right? So the practical implications is exactly that. Because if you have non-sterilizing immunity, that means you still have some viral replication, and then whether you can pass it on, that's another question, right?
Okay.
That opens up the possibility that you might be able to.
Okay. So now let's go. That was kind of all deep there. So let me go to some more general, deep for me at least. So let's go to some more general. When do you think things are going to be back to normal for the United States? Let's just say United States.
I mean,
you answer that. But.
well, it depends. You know, I think it's pretty clear, and it was pretty obvious that like at the beginning, this vaccine rollout was just going to be, there's no good way to do this. People are going to complain because there's a limited amount of supply and like a lot of people that want it. I'm hoping that as time goes by, that more of these vaccines will have emergency use authorization in the U.S. and in other places, and then we'll have more supply of different vaccines that are around. So, eventually we'll have like a surplus of vaccines compared to like how many people want. So I think when that happens, I have no idea. I'm going to guess that kind of surplus will be around, maybe I'm hoping in May and June. So I think by the end of the summer, you're gonna start seeing essentially this fade away, where you're just gonna see a drop. You're gonna see a drop in hospitalizations. There'll probably be still low levels of cases all come up among the unvaccinated, maybe among the vaccinated, depending on what these other strains do.
Yeah. Okay.
But I still don't think those people are gonna. At least my numbers will be hospitalized. So I think people will essentially, at some point, just let their guard down, take off their masks, go back to usual. I think classes will be back in the fall here. So that's my prediction, but
Okay, who knows, right? But but your word is definitely better than anyone. So, and then what about globally? I guess they're saying that lesser developed countries will not have as much access to the vaccine. And will this restrict international travel because countries will be on different periods? There'll be a different amounts of people being vaccinated. So will that restrict international travel? Will it affect the global pandemic?
I certainly that's a huge issue, right? It's kind of like the unevenness and inequality how these vaccines are distributed. It's possible that some of these one-shot vaccines that are coming out will help a lot, especially in the developed countries, at least to bring it to those levels where people aren't getting hospitalized anymore, and then people are just going to go back to their normal. If people aren't getting hospitalized, people become like less afraid of getting sick, and then, there's like 8 billion people in the world. It's going to take, a while.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, some countries, it's going to be worse in some places rather than others. And, what each country ends up doing to kind of restrict spread in their own country, and they have to, I guess, weigh their economic impacts of that versus health impacts.
Yeah.
We're still going to see cases, I think, globally for at least the next couple of years. I think once some countries are kind of more or less fully vaccinated, I think there's going to be less. There won't be probably restrictions coming into the U.S. or Europe or something once essentially all the hospital cases go away, right? It'd be very surprising.
Okay. Another thing is, personally, I'm in Japan. I don't know if you could answer this, but what do you think about the Olympics, an international event like the Olympics being held in July? Is that possible?
Honestly, if it were me, I would push it. I don't know what the vaccination. I would at least for Japan itself, right? Because you guys haven't started yet, so
we haven't started, yeah.
And I don't, and it might be that Japan is better at rolling out the vaccine when they do start. I have a feeling that they're a little less insane than we are to try to because in the U.S. it's basically like 50 different states, 50 different ways to do it, so it's kind of insane. I would think that'd be, but July is like, they should just delay it a few months, I think, because I think by the end of the summer it'd be a little better off, and it won't be, I think that couple months, because you still need time for like people to get vaccinated and then people develop immunity, right? So, you need a month and a half after that person gets vaccinated, or the last, like, let's say 30% of people get vaccinated to have like pretty good herd immunity in your country.
Yeah.
So I would think for just Japan's sake that they don't want like 1 million people coming over.
No, I can't imagine. I can't imagine people coming into Japan. I can imagine an Olympics with no spectators, maybe, but even that, I don't even, I'm not even
It
sure.
almost seems like better economically that they just delay it like a few months, because by that time maybe parts of Europe will be more vaccinated, parts of the U.S., and then they could do something
Yeah.
where let vaccinated people in or something to.
And also middle of summer, I don't know why they held it in August, which is the hottest time of the year here. And in the fall, even cooler. So, but I will say
September,
that I
October is
think
nice, isn't it?
it's perfect. Yeah, it's at least cooler than August. So, but I will say I think that Japan does have a good distribution system, and they are good. That is a strength of theirs. So I think that is something that will maybe make it more possible. But I don't know. I really don't know. Maybe we do have a smaller area here too. It is easier to move things out. So I don't know. But that's just my take
I
on
mean, they have a
how
better public healthcare system there anyway, right? Ours, the one in the U.S.
I
is
don't
fully
know.
disjointed.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar. I mean, I have no experience with the American system, and but it is very good. It's very good. Yeah, definitely. So, all right. Well, tell you what. It's been 1 hour, and I know I said we were going to just do 30, so I'm gonna
That's all right.
let you go there, just to stop it at the end of the hour, just to make it nice and round. So, I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it. And I thank everybody who's watching there. A few people asked questions too. And please remember, I'm going to post Brian's CDC podcast on my Twitter page. So you can go there and see it there. And I'll also post a link to his blog, which is an excellent blog. And you guys can.
I'll try to update it more often now.
Okay, yeah, sure. That'd be great. So, thanks again. Thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, please check that out. So thanks for watching, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you in the next broadcast. Take care. Bye for now.